Today, we're jumping back to 1977 to break down a really pivotal sermon by Sun Myung Moon, the founder of the Unification Church. And it's all centered on one of our most basic human emotions, tears. In this explainer, we're going to see how he built an entire theology and a pretty intense call to action all around the simple act of crying.
So Moon kicked off his sermon with this exact question. It's a powerful way to start, isn't it? He's not just asking about sadness in general. He's pushing his followers, and, well, us, to really think about the purpose behind our tears. Are they for ourselves, or are they for something much, much bigger? This question is really the key that unlocks his entire argument.
All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with Moon's core idea, his theology of tears. Then we'll look at how he sees all of human history through this lens of sorrow. From there, we'll dive into God's grief, the mission he gave his followers, and finally, wrap up with why these tears were so incredibly important to him. Okay, so let's get right into the core argument. At the heart of this entire sermon is a fundamental distinction. Moon argues that not all tears are created equal. He basically says there are two totally different types, and understanding this difference is everything. This slide lays out the thesis perfectly. On one side, you have selfish tears. Moon traces these all the way back to Adam and Eve, who he says cried for their own misery after the fall, which just kept them in that fallen state. But on the other side, you have selfless tears. These come from God and Jesus. And these tears, the ones shed for others, are the only way to what he calls restoration, basically healing humanity's broken relationship with God.
So, what Moon does next is he takes this idea and just blows it up to cover all of human history. He argues that the selfish sorrow of Adam and Eve didn't just stay with them. It became this inherited trait, the thing that has defined the human experience for thousands of years.
He describes it as a kind of spiritual chain reaction. It starts with Adam and Eve's self-centered tears. Then it just spreads generation after generation until it's infected all of humanity. In this view, history is just an endless cycle of suffering and heartbreak. A pattern of people and nations all grieving over their own problems, repeating that original mistake over and over and over again. This quote just nails his diagnosis of the human condition. He's arguing that humanity is fundamentally trapped in this loop of selfish grief, totally unable to see past its own pain. And for him, this is the problem that absolutely has to be solved. So if history is defined by the wrong kind of tears, what's the right kind? Well, this brings us to the divine standard. Moon presents a solution, a model of selfless grief that he says people have to learn to copy. And he points to two main examples, God and, most importantly, Jesus Christ. This is such a pivotal moment in the sermon. Moon holds up Jesus on the cross as the ultimate, #1 example of selfless tears. He's not crying because of his own pain. He's crying for the very people who put him there. This act, weeping for your enemies, becomes the absolute highest standard of love. And this idea completely redefines what it means to be holy. A patriot might cry for their country, but Moon says a true saint goes way beyond that. A saint adopts God's point of view, and they shed tears for all of humanity, every single nation, every race. It's a universal sorrow, not a tribal one. And you've got to understand, this theology wasn't just some abstract concept to think about. It was a direct instruction, a very real mission for the members of his church. They weren't just supposed to understand this idea, they were commanded to go out and live it. Their whole spiritual journey was to become a champion of tears. Moon laid out this really clear two-stage path. First, a follower had to learn how to cry for the world, to climb what he called the human hill of tears, by really feeling the suffering of all people. But that wasn't the final destination. The next step was to go even deeper, to climb the divine hill and actually experience and shed the tears of God himself. This also led to a very, very specific definition of repentance. In this context, it has nothing to do with feeling sorry for your own mistakes. Instead, true repentance is an outward-facing act. It's about sharing in God's grief for a broken world. It's about feeling God's own aching heart and weeping right alongside him. And that brings us to the next phase, action. This incredibly profound emotional state wasn't meant to just stay internal. It was designed to be the fuel for intense, difficult, real-world work. The tears had to lead directly to action.
And the tasks Moon assigned were incredibly specific. He told his followers to seek out difficult situations, what he called the battleground for tears, things like confronting persecution, going door to door to 360 homes, or volunteering in the most miserable places. These weren't just duties, they were environments specifically engineered to provoke selfless sorrow, creating this powerful, shared emotional experience that would unify the group.
And for Moon, this was absolutely crucial. Action by itself was worthless. He was so explicit about it. Sweat and even blood are completely meaningless if they aren't accompanied by selfless tears. The tears were the essential link, the spiritual ingredient that connected a person's physical effort to what he called God's work.
Okay, let's just pull all of this together. We've seen theology, and we've seen the required actions. But what was the ultimate purpose? Why build an entire movement around the concept of sorrowful tears?
This quote really shows his mission in the West. He saw America as a place with tons of material wealth but was, in his view, spiritually bankrupt. And the one thing it was missing, he claimed, were selfless tears. So his movement, filled with people who had wet eyes, was positioned to fill that spiritual void.
And here it is, the grand cosmic endgame. The followers' mission was to literally cry on God's behalf, to feel his sorrow so deeply that they could shed all of his tears for him. Once God had no more tears left to cry, his pain from the fall of man would finally be healed. And this single act, according to the sermon, would not only fix God's aching heart, but would ultimately restore the entire world.
This sermon is such a powerful example of an emotional theology, framing a single feeling as both the problem and the solution for all of history. And in doing that, it motivated a community toward a very specific and incredibly demanding mission. It leaves us with a final, broader question, something to think about. How does focusing a group's entire identity on one powerful emotion, whether it's sorrow or joy or anger, shape what they believe, what they do, and who they ultimately become?